August 20th, 1944. Near Chambois, the air shivers as every hedgerow hides a muzzle flash, and the sky seems to fold inward. Paul Hauser leans over a map when the first supersonic cracks snap past, and then the ground detonates in a single shuddering chorus. There is no warning blast to dive after, no scattered opening shots. Everything arrives together, and the bunker's walls spit dust. A few thousand yards away, a column stretches through orchards toward the last road east. Drivers grip wheels with white knuckles. Horses balk. Then, without a first thud to alert anyone, the road vanishes under overlapping bursts, and engines die like snuffed candles. By the end of this, you'll see how a clock and a slide rule did what courage could not. If you want war told from the bunker and the Fire Direction Center, subscribe now. Stay with me as we watch an army try to leave a trap faster than math can close it. 6 weeks earlier, the German front in Normandy had bent but not broken. By mid-August, it sagged into a pocket. After the U.S. breakout from the west, British and Canadian forces drove south through Caen, and the 1st Canadian Army clawed toward Falaise. Operations Totalize and Tractable pushed through villages and wheat fields, aiming to pinch off the German 7th Army between Falaise and Argentan. At the center of that squeeze stood Chambois and the high ground of Montormel, Hill 262. The Polish 1st Armored Division under Stanisław Maciek drove for those heights, cutting sight lines over the German escape corridor. To the south, U.S. 15th Corps pressed north past Argentan, placing American guns within reach of the narrow roads feeding east across the Dive River. Berlin wanted a counterattack to stabilize a line. Reality gave the Germans one paved road and a lattice of dirt tracks, all under eyes and aircraft. Hauser, 7th Army commander and a veteran of hard retreats, faced a binary choice: hold and be crushed in place, or move and risk being cut apart on the roads. Even as higher headquarters authorized a withdrawal through the shrinking gap, units were already moving east in darkness, hoping to slip the vise. What looked like a fighting retreat on the map was a catastrophe in motion on the ground. Panther and Tiger II tanks rolled at walking pace because wagons filled the verges. Fuel, ammunition, and wounded packed every vehicle. Daylight invited rocket-bearing Hawker Typhoons and strafing P-47 Thunderbolts. Nighttime offered mud, wrecks, and the sound of bridges coming down. American artillery had spent years turning fire into a system, not a collection of guns. 15th. Corps sat at the hub of switches, telephones, and radio nets, with a headquarters that treated the battlefield like a grid waiting to be scheduled. Observers, on church towers, in aircraft, along hedgerows, called in positions by map coordinates and reference points, and the network converted plain talk into numbers. Time on target tied it together. Officers calculated time of flight from each battery to the aim point, then ordered distant guns to fire first and closer guns later, so the first salvos landed together. If soldiers lived between the first and second shell, then removing the gap weaponized time. The trick was not mystical. It was math under pressure. Behind the firing tables lay details the front line rarely saw. Powder temperature, barrel wear, and wind aloft took their places on worksheets. Meteorological messages arrived on schedule, and crews adjusted fuse settings to create air bursts or quick fuses for tree bursts when canopy was available. Proximity fuses remained restricted for ground use at this stage in Europe, so gunners relied on careful timing and terrain to lift bursts over open columns. Centralization made speed plausible. Corps artillery officers massed battalions across divisions without asking each rifle regiment for permission. A single voice on the net could assign dozens of batteries to the same grid square and clear the airspace for attack aircraft seconds later. Ammunition dumps fed trucks in loops, and drivers ran round-the-clock cycles to keep 105 min 125 and 155 mm stacks high enough to sustain the schedule. The Corps Fire Direction Center used synchronized watches the way infantry used rifles. The hour for a mission might be 13:22:30, and clocks were checked every hour like ritual. A lieutenant lined his pencil down the chart and called out times. Fire commands rolled outward in waves. Deflection, quadrant, charge, fuse, time, and the guns answered with metallic clacks and steady thunder. TOTS worked because they stole reaction. When the first shell lands alone, everyone dives. When the first 20 arrive together, the open road becomes the worst place to be. Increasing the number of batteries sharpened that edge. A battalion firing as one made a shock, but a corps grouping created a single, continuous sheet of shrapnel and concussion across a choke point. The design goal was not just to kill, but to break the column's rhythm. Interdiction fires aimed to cut bridges, crater crossroads, and isolate pockets of vehicles. Once a column halted, aircraft came in or adjacent batteries shifted aim to the ends, creating a box. What could move did so in panic. What could not became a stationary target that attracted the schedule again. Allied air-ground coordination multiplied that effect. Liaison officers in the FDC worked with air support controllers, handing off grids from guns to fighter bombers. Typhoons fired rockets into the densest knots, and P-47s shredded soft-skinned vehicles that guns had forced off the road. When a pair of planes pulled away, the display board flipped back to artillery call signs, and the next mission fired. Meanwhile, on the northern lip of the pocket, Canadian Corps artillery beat down counterattacks and shelled exits toward Trun. The Polish 1st Armored Division's guns on Mont Ormel reached south and east, snaring columns that tried to slip through the open ground below Hill 262. Their ridge dominated the road net. Every bend that exposed a vehicle also exposed it to forward observers. Logistics underwrote this tempo. Ammunition points shifted forward as roads opened, and repair crews kept guns firing through barrel swaps and traverse fixes. Radio repair vans glued the net back together when dust and blast shook sets apart. All of it lived under one simple rule. The clocks had to agree. Back on the roads, German officers tried to impose order with whistles and pistols. The next village promised cover, if only the wagons moved, but every halt carried a price. Gaps that formed in the march were filled by wounded carts, and tank drivers hesitated to crush their own lifeline. Now the trap starts to spring in real time. Afternoon haze hangs over the orchards as Maczek's troops on Hill 262 call fresh movement to the south. The American net lights up, and a corps artillery major traces 3 red X's across a wall map. The bridge west of Chambois, the crossroads north of it, and the curve near the farm line. Observers count the tailgates. One notes a pair of Panthers, 3 half-tracks, and a string of wagons, then asks for a check fire to adjust. The reply comes back negative. This will be a blind tot, built on surveyed positions and practice. Watches snap to the second, and the countdown begins at scattered posts miles apart. On the road itself, dust hangs and visibility drops to 50 yards. Oxen strain at yokes, and a driver leans his head out of a truck window trying to spot the verge. The first surprise is not sound, but pressure. A slap of air that turns into layered blasts, and the entire line shivers as dozens of shells scissor into branches and roadbed. A Tiger II takes the first impacts on the front slope. Armor holds, but a fragment shreds the exposed antenna, and the commander disappears into the turret. The crew can hear shouting, but not the words. Horses rear and scream. An engine coughs into silence, and a man grabs a limp wrist and goes still as the next sheet of shrapnel hacks through canvas. Downrange, another battery is already shifting fire to the road's exit point. Smoke charges stack a screen across the low ground beyond the bridge, so anyone who makes it across has to slow in a white cloud. Fighters call in overhead, and the FDC gives them the road segment beyond the smoke. Rockets punch into the blur, and secondary explosions chase each other like a chain. The timing stays merciless. 5 miles away, a set of 155s fired first to account for longer time of flight, their shells crossing the last 500 yards as 105s cough a second later. The craters overlap. A field kitchen cart flips on its side, spilling pans into a ditch, and a Panzerschreck team dives behind a trunk that doesn't exist a heartbeat later. During the lull that follows, survivors scramble to clear the road. A sergeant orders the Panther forward to push Rex aside. Its tracks finally bite into an axle and wrench it free, but the delay is the cue for the second mission. The next taut lands on the curve the tank has to make, and the driver sees the hedgerow ahead vaporize into splinters. At the Polish positions, the ridge vibrates with reciprocal fire as German units try to pry open a path to the east. Maciek's men hold the crest, calling for their own artillery, and the battlefield becomes a lattice of intersecting barrages. Each exchange burns fuel the Germans don't have and minutes they can't afford. In the 15th Corps FDC, heat builds. Telephones ring over one another, and a captain scratches out ammunition numbers on a chalkboard, instructing battalions to rotate to keep barrels cool. Crew chiefs chase powder lot reports. Charges with known burn rates are matched to range tables to tighten dispersion at the chosen grid. Dusk does not grant mercy. As the light fades, harassing and interdiction fires take over, pre-planned concentrations fired at set intervals to deny sleep and movement. Without aircraft to mask them, the guns own the darkness. The schedule paints a staircase of impacts up and down the road net, and every attempt to bunch forces for a breakout collects under a predicted box. In a farmhouse east of Chambois, a German aide spreads a map beside a guttering candle. Hauser bends over it, hearing only fractions of the briefing, and nods to push the next group through the gap. The building shakes hard enough to turn the flame sideways, and plaster crumbs hiss into the soup bowl on the table. No one runs to the window first. The first cluster lands already on target, punching into the yard and road at the same instant. A shard scythes through the doorway and tears into the wall, and Hauser staggers as shrapnel picks him up and strips his vision to gray at the edges. Medics shoulder into the room in seconds, sliding him onto a stretcher while the second wave takes the roof tiles. While that stretcher heads to a field aid post, the fight outside the farmhouse grows stranger. Shell bursts kick the last wagons off the road and into ditches. A radio operator on the German side turns a crank desperately to reach anyone who can coordinate, but the wire line is already severed. The pocket no longer behaves like an army. It behaves like a million disjointed decisions under fire. Parked guns on the Polish ridge fire, final defensive concentrations. In the American sector, guns with hot barrels switch positions to avoid counter-battery. Canadian units fight through Trun and push south, tying off the pocket's northern edge. Every link shrinks the space to aim at, and the artillery becomes more efficient with each contraction. Dawn breaks on another day of the same, mathematics. Survivors hug hedgerows until aircraft arrive, then rush into orchards when guns lift and planes pass. A few groups slip past the killing ground, mostly on foot, stepping around burned-out frames and abandoned guns. The bulk of heavy equipment lies in the fields, wheels futured into mud by blast. By the last day, the escape corridor narrows to a few fields and cart tracks marked by twisted metal. Polish troops on Mont Ormel hold out under counterattack and dwindling ammunition. South of them, American infantry closes another mile. Pressure from every side and from the sky squeezes the pocket to a seam. At a checkpoint near Chambois, a handful of German officers surrender to a Canadian patrol under a white cloth. Further west, A U.S. reconnaissance troop radios that they see Polish tanks on the ridge and Canadian carriers in the hedgerows. The guns fire one last concentration on a bridge that no longer matters. In the quiet that follows, the clocks in the FDC tick at the same speed, and the operators finally look at each other instead of the charts. The stretcher with Hauser reached a rear aid station where surgeons worked through blast cases without pause. His wound pulled him from the front as the last arcs of fire landed along the dive's crossings. Records vary on the exact count of destroyed vehicles littering those roads, but the roads themselves were enough of a report. By the time the last shots faded, Canadian, Polish, and American units linked up near Chambois-Trun and slammed the gap shut. Tens of thousands surrendered, and those who escaped did so with little beyond rifles and what they could carry. That closure broke the back of German resistance in Normandy and opened a highway to the Seine. The pursuit east accelerated, and the 7th Army as a coherent force was gone for the rest of the campaign. Allied staffs kept the lesson. Schedule beats improvisation when space narrows. Artillery procedures, air-ground links, and clock discipline moved from theory to doctrine with renewed confidence. Time, not bravado, decided this ground. When fire arrives together, the window to act vanishes, and a moving army becomes a set of targets on a timetable. If this kind of brutal systems-level storytelling is your thing, subscribe for the next battle where the map, the clock, and the guns decide the ending.